The Chareidi basically want to influence the state without taking responsibility to the consequences of them. Just like they are today in the government, in power, and they are deciding for us whether there will be a war or peace in Gaza or in Lebanon, despite none of them will send his kids to the war, they want to decide what should be the policies for conversion, kashrut, and others issues, and none of them will rely on the kashrut of the rabbinate. None of them will rely on the conversions of the rabbinate.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Over the past 2 weeks, there has been increasing conversation in Israel among the Religious Zionist community about the continued refusal of many ultra-Orthodox Jews to consider enlisting in the Israeli army. Many of us have been discussing this issue for months or years, but it came to a head in the past couple of weeks, largely because of the attempt by the Chareidi political parties in the Knesset to enshrine this exemption through legislation. The most recent attempt was the so-called Daycare Bill, which, if passed, would mean that the status of the father would not be taken into account when determining if a couple is eligible for state subsidies for daycare. This might seem like an obscure bill, but it's understood by almost everyone to be a backdoor attempt to effectively legalize draft dodging by the Chareidi population by removing one of the financial disincentives to ignoring a draft notice. The question of Chareidi avoidance of the draft opens up a number of questions about Chareidi political influence on the wider Israeli public. This is obvious in numerous areas, including, most recently, the election of new chief rabbis by the State of Israel. Because the vote for the two chief rabbis is heavily influenced by political factors and by politicians, the Chareidi political parties have a huge influence on who is chief rabbi, more than any other sector, even though, ironically, their communities are largely unaffected by the rabbinate's authority. There are many other areas where Chareidi political influence is affecting the rest of Israeli society, including kashrut, personal status, marriage and divorce, and conversion. As Rav David Stav, the founder of Sohar, says, the problem is not Chareidi influence. The problem is Charedim determining the law of the land while not being bound or affected by the consequences of those laws. This is a serious issue for Jews, no matter where they reside, and I was honored to speak to Rabbi Stav about the current situation and what needs to change. Before we get to that conversation, I also want to mention something else about the recent election of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States. It's pretty clear that the majority of Orthodox Jews in the U.S. voted for Trump. The following may be surprising to some, given that I was quite openly anti-Trump before and during his first term, but I actually have no quarrel with their decision to vote for him last week. I felt that both candidates were extremely flawed in numerous ways, and if people felt that Trump were the better candidate, I understand why they voted that way. I wrote about the election results in my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, in an article entitled Initial Thoughts After Yet Another Trump Electoral Victory. I want to read you an email from a Kamala Harris voter who read my article and listened to last week's episode of the podcast. I am so disappointed with our great country. I am angry and quick to point the finger at the, quote, deplorables, the Hispanics, the under 30s, the list goes on. I appreciate the raw emotion that is triggering all of this, and I am also aware that empathy and understanding has to be my guide as I recover from this trauma. With all that said, I am loath to give the Orthodox community a pass. I am so ashamed of being part of it right now. How have we normalized Trump and have been able to rationalize an evil player without speaking out? The comparisons of these two candidates by the Jewish media, Orthodox rabbis, and day school teachers are obscene in their own right. A convicted criminal, convicted sex abuser, to a legitimate candidate with perhaps flawed policies. These comparisons create a false equivalency that obscures important ethical differences. On a more personal note, two very difficult moments for me occurred yesterday. One was listening to people in the Orthodox world praise Trump, speaking about him as if he is a great man. No way I can even start to critique that. The second was watching videos of about 50 to 100 Orthodox high school students with MAGA hats and large Trump banners parading around their day school chanting USA. I am hoping that the perceived loss of a moral compass amongst Orthodox leaders is short-lived. They need to speak out about the lack of morality exhibited by this man. They need to speak out about the division he creates. And they need to speak out against future policies which are morally repugnant. When the mass deportations start, when families are split up and detention camps begin to fill up, all in the name of illegal immigration, it will be too late. We are currently having our bedroom painted. Our Hispanic painter, who speaks no English, but has incredible chen and kindness in his body language and smile, is likely to be corralled like cattle in a few short months. How shameful it is that our shuls and schools are celebrating these future acts instead of empathizing with this plight. Quote, "And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Okay, I'm not going to comment on much of what this individual wrote. You can decide for yourself what you think. But it was important for me to quote his letter in full for two reasons. First, because I want to differentiate between the approving of the candidate Donald Trump and lionizing the human being Donald Trump. If you thought that he is the better candidate and will be the better president, and if you don't think his character should be relevant to his job as president, I may agree or disagree, but I'm glad you voted according to your conscience. I have a problem, however, when people begin to believe that Trump the man is some sort of tzaddik. I think that it's beyond debate that Trump is a bully, that he's a serial admitted adulterer, that his language is at times exceedingly offensive, that he's a narcissist, and more. In short, that his personal moral compass should never be a model for Torah-observant Jews, or for that matter, anyone. Many of his characteristics, in fact, are antithetical to Torah Judaism. Again, if you think that none of that is relevant to his ability to be a good leader, and if you believe that he will implement good and moral policies, I understand and respect that argument. I have a problem, however, when we start to think of him as a model. Once that happens, we are truly moving in a dangerous and anti-Torah direction. Our political viewpoint cannot allow us to be blind to that which is morally unacceptable, or to justify unacceptable behavior. Doing so is outrageous. Second, it seems that there are some people in the Orthodox world who have turned voting for Trump into an almost religious obligation. Even if they strongly believe that he is the better candidate and that it's terribly mistaken for Jews to vote for anyone else, it's important not to allow this opinion to lead to the disenfranchising of other Orthodox Jews. I know many well-meaning, God-fearing, and Torah-centric Orthodox Jews who would never vote for Trump. And just because the majority of the Orthodox world disagrees with them, we dare not make them feel that their political opinions are somehow inadmissible or not really Orthodox. Let's not fall into the trap of dividing our community by political affiliation. It would be a terrible mistake. That means that shul rabbis should make it clear that if they voice a political opinion, they are voicing it as American citizens, not as religious leaders whose opinion somehow carries greater weight than a layperson's. And by the same token, we need to make sure that our religious institutions, schools and shuls alike, don't become associated with one particular political position or candidate. I've been thinking that this could all be the beginning of a more substantive conversation about the place of politics in Jewish institutional life, as well as balancing political belief with clear-eyed understanding of the flaws of those who may be our political heroes. If you think that we should discuss this further, please drop me a line by writing to scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com. These same fears of the mixture of religious institutions with political positions is a big problem here in Israel, and that again brings me to my conversation with Rav David Stav, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi David Stav is the chief rabbi of the city of Shoham and the co-founder and chairman of Tzohar, a group of hundreds of Israeli religious Zionist rabbis that works to bridge social gaps in Israeli society through the embrace of respectful approaches to Jewish tradition. a past candidate for the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Stav addresses a wide variety of issues related to religion and state in Israel, and in particular, the need for a moderate religious voice on issues like military enlistment, kashrut supervision, marriage and divorce, and, in general, countering a trend of Chareidi takeover of Israel's religious institutions and identity. Harav David Stav, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast. I want to first ask you about your organization, Tzohar. I'd like to know what it is and why it's necessary.
Yes. In Israel, unlike Western countries, the state and church situation is different. In Israel, by law, every couple has to get married through the religion is associated with, which means that every Jewish couple that wants to get married in Israel needs to get married through the chief rabbinate in Israel. Now, if you are observant, that's not a problem. If you are not observant, and most of the Israelis are not observant, they ask themselves, why should they get married through a rabbinate that they don't believe in its values, they don't believe in its religion, etc., etc. That's without any problem in the rabbinate system of getting married. Assuming that everything is great and the customer service is great and there's no bureaucracy and there is no obstacle that is raised in front of the couples, but everything goes smoothly, yet many people would say, well, we don't want to get married through a religious institute. But if we know that in most of the cases, or many cases, the monopole of the rabbinate works as a bureaucracy, and therefore a lot of couples get a very, very problematic treatment in the offices of the rabbinate. They waste a lot of time in being registered in these offices. Many of them started to leave the rabbinate and to fly to Cyprus. And for us, the people flying to Cyprus, it's not only breaking their heart that these couples will not get married halachically, but we know that the meaning of that is 10 times worse. Whoever will get married in Cyprus, his Jewishness will be questioned because the rabbis in 10, 20 years will ask themselves, this couple was born in Israel, why did they fly to Cyprus? Most probably there is a reason. And the reason is that one of the spouses is not Jewish. So eventually, the current situation caused a lot of couples, actually today it's about 20-25% of the couples in Israel, to fly to Cyprus or elsewhere in Europe in order to get married. We in Tzohar, we said we cannot change the law, but we can change the way we implement the law. We understand that the law requires Jewish marriage, but we can make the Jewish marriage in a better, in a more user-friendly. We can make the experience of getting married an inspirational experience and not something which is very technical. So all of a sudden, people started to understand that there is an alternative to the way things were done in Israel until Tzohar was founded. That's how we started Tzohar, and that's why Tzohar is so needed, because the monopoly needs somebody that will challenge him, somebody that will say things could be done nicer and better, and secular people could be attracted to Jewish ceremonies. It's just a question how you put it to them and how you package it to them.
Then, Rav Stav, would you suggest that the monopoly that the chief rabbinate currently has over many aspects of personal life in Israel, such as marriage and divorce, should be maintained? Because if the only problem is we have to make it more user-friendly, there's no inherent problem, it seems, with having no separation between church and state. Or are you saying something different, that it would be better if there were a greater separation between church and state and if the monopoly of the chief rabbinate were broken?
I think that the current situation is the worst. There is no separation between state and church, and the politicians are running the religious life of the state of Israel, which causes a lot of hatred. Because once people feel that maybe the reason why certain bills are imposed on them, it's because of a political pressure of one party on another, that's something that creates a lot of hatred. And the price of hatred to Judaism we pay on a daily basis.
So do you think there should be a separation between church or religion and
There
state?
should be a separation between religion and politicians. What does it mean? Politicians have to remove their hands from everything religious. They have to take care about security, economy, welfare. They should not deal with religious issues. Religious issues should stay something that is in the people's beliefs, in people's minds, in people's hearts. It should not be something that is established and formulated by a law.
Okay. Would that mean in practice, if it were removed from the politicians per se, that there would be no formalized chief rabbinate in Israel? I'm sorry to hunker down on this. I'm just trying to understand better. Should there be a chief rabbinate that is invested with power by the state, or should that not exist?
In the way it's functioning today we had new elections. I hope that the new chief rabbi will change something about that. But in the way it was run in the last 10 years, it's better not to be than to be in this way.
Let's talk about that new chief rabbi. His name is Rav Kalman Ber. I don't know anything about him. I know that you supported his candidacy. Why did you, Rav Stav, want him to be the chief rabbi? Why did you support his candidacy?
Look, I think that in most areas that the chief rabbinate should take a position, the chief rabbinate is stuck because it's under very heavy pressures of the Chareidi politicians, and therefore there is no chance that a rabbi will be able to make any meaningful change in any topic that you will have to deal with, whether it's marriage, conversion, kashrut, etc., etc. I don't see a rabbi dares to fight against the Chareidi ultra-Orthodox rabbinic leadership. But once I cannot expect from no rabbi to do any real changes in the policies of the chief rabbinate, the only thing that remain important in this institution is the fact that the rabbis will be positive rabbis in the way they look at the Israeli society, in the way they speak to the people. And I think Rav Kalman Ber represents an approach of welcoming, embracing, not being judgmental, not being very self-minded, ideological, that thinks that your ideology is the only one that exists, is much more pragmatic and much more practical.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, Rav Stav, you're saying that this still isn't the ideal situation. He's not the person who's going to fix everything, but given the constraints and restrictions that are already imposed upon us by the nature of the way the chief rabbinate works and the political connections that are involved in it and the Chareidi dominance of it, he was the best option for what we could do.
Exactly.
I certainly agree with everything you've said until now. I'm on the same page when it comes to Chareidi dominance, but I'd like to ask a bit about why that's a problem. Even though I agree that it is, I'm coming from the same position. Why do you see Chareidi dominance of the chief rabbinate and of, in general, questions of personal status and law to be a problem? The reason I'm asking that is that, practically speaking, living in a democracy, the way that this happened largely, though not exclusively, is because the Chareidi parties have more members in Knesset than the Dati Leumi, the national religious parties. And because of that, that would imply they have a stronger political clout, and therefore they, by the laws of democracy, should have a greater say in terms of these. Why do you not agree with that?
Well, first of all, I disagree with the facts you mentioned as like they were the facts in the ground. That's not true. It's not true that the Chareidi Knesset members have more than the Dati Leumi people in the Knesset. As a matter of fact, today there are about 25, if not 30 Dati Leumi Knesset members all over the Knesset versus 15 or 16 Chareidi Knesset members. But I think it's not a question of numbers. So first of all, the numbers are different than the ones that you mentioned.
I mean, though, parties. Dati Leumi parties don't have as much control. Those Dati Leumi members are in parties like the Likud, for example.
Right, Likud and Machane Mamlachti and the Yesh Atid, etc., etc. But I think the issue is more than that. If you would ask, if there was no coalition obedience, and you would ask coalition discipline, and you would ask the Knesset members to vote based on their own consciousness position, what are their positions in all set of issues? I'm sure, no doubt, that between 60 to 80% of the Knesset members would vote against the Chareidi approach in any topic that relates to the chief rabbi. So they are taking advantage of the weakness of our democratic system. And since they know that Netanyahu is ready to pay, not only Netanyahu, but any candidate to be prime minister that will have a chance to make a coalition with them are ready to pay any price for the Chareidi demands on the expense of most of the people that do not want it to happen. So it's using the democratic system in order to implement their views, but it's legal. I'm not saying it's not legal, but it stinks because everybody knows that 60-70% of the people want different policy. I will give an example from the draft bill that is now on the public discussion. If the Knesset will pass a bill that releases Chareidi yeshiva boys from going to the army, because they will say that if you don't pass this bill, we will go to elections. Is it legitimate? It's legitimate. Is it against democracy? No, it's not against democracy. Does it mean that the vast majority of the Israeli society are in favor of that? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that they took advantage of a political situation and took advantage on certain circumstances and used it for them. But still, I could argue and I could say that's wrong. You actually take advantage and you actually you nightmare the prime minister, and you tell him, if you don't do that, you come like with a revolver and a bullet in it, and you threaten him. You say, if you don't listen to my demands, this and this will happen. It's true. It's legitimate. It's not something which is not legal, but it stinks.
I understand that. And what you're saying now reminds me of the line attributed to Winston Churchill: democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. There are serious flaws in democracy, even though we don't want to replace it with something else.
Right.
I want to ask more about the Chareidi approach. And what I mean by that is, in saying that the Chareidi approach is not the approach of 60 to 70% of the electorate, what exactly is the Chareidi approach? When it comes to the military, we understand they want to get draft exemptions. When it comes to kollel, they want to get money for kollel. But in halacha in general, when it comes to things like Shabbat, when it comes to things like kashrut, when it comes to other areas on which the Chareidi parties have influence, what exactly is the Chareidi approach, and why do you disagree with it?
I think that, first of all, it's not fair to say the Chareidi approach, because I'm not sure that there is one Chareidi approach, just like there is no one modern Orthodox approach to any issue. So I think it's not fair to say the Chareidi approach. But what is perceived today as the Chareidi approach, at least which is represented through their politicians? The Chareidi basically want to influence the state without taking responsibility to the consequences of them. Just like they are today in the government, in power, and they are deciding for us whether there will be a war or peace in Gaza or in Lebanon, despite none of them will send his kids to the war. They want to decide what should be the policies for conversion, kashrut, and others issues, and none of them will rely on the kashrut of the rabbinate. None of them will rely on the conversions of the rabbinate. And I say to them, look, if you are ready to take responsibility on the consequences, you want to tell me how will I be able to run a country where hundreds of thousands of Russians are not converted because of your policy. If you want to tell me how could I run the situation where more than 50% of the restaurants in Israel are not kosher because of strict policies of rabbinates that turns away a lot of owners of restaurants that say that we don't want to deal with this. I'm asking them, well, you want influence, you want power, but you don't confront with the results, with the consequences. That's not fair. If you would trust the institution of the chief rabbinate and you would fight for that, okay, fine. But you don't believe in this for 1 minute. You don't rely on the kashrut of the rabbinate. None of the Chareidi will eat from kashrut of rabbinate. None of them will trust the conversion that is done in the rabbinate. And yet you insist to decide who will be the judges that will convert and who will be the rabbis that will give kashrut. That's not fair.
In that case, what's the reason that they do care? If they're not going to hold by those judges or by that kashrut, then why do they insist on having certain standards if they're not going to follow them anyway?
Basically, it's a question of power. If I run the kashrut system, I have jobs for thousands of my voters that I never train them. I never send them to universities to learn high technology, to learn what can they do in their lives? They could be supervisors. So I want to be in power in order to make sure that there will be the supervisors. I want to make sure that there will be the people that will be the judges for conversion. Because otherwise, what we'll do with them?
So, Rav Stav, what would you define as a moderate voice? I know in your bio that your office sent me before we spoke today, you're described as someone who wants to have a moderate voice, a respectful attitude. How would an attitude that you would embody and that you support be different from the way things are now? What is moderation, in other words, in a way that still is showing fealty to halacha?
The Torah demands that we should build an altar which is not one stone. It should be built out of a few stones. And Rav Kook explains how come the Torah, that in the time of our ancestors, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, allowed to sacrifices on a matzeva, on one stone altar, why did it prohibit that afterwards? And Rav Kook says, because in worshiping Hashem, we have to understand that there are different stones. I wouldn't use 12 stones, but it could be 12 stones. There are different ways of worshiping Hashem. And I think what the biggest problem of the chief rabbinate is, especially about the Chareidi approach to the chief rabbinate, that they don't give any legitimacy to another way of worshiping Hashem. And I think that's the biggest problem. I have no problem with the fact that Charedim, and by the way, I helped and I insisted that Chareidi rabbis that didn't like the conversion of the chief rabbinate will not be forced by the government to recognize the validity of these conversions, although they receive the salary from the government. And I said, no, they are entitled to their approach, to their views. I don't want to force no rabbi to work against his consciousness. But my problem with them is not the fact that they are stricter in certain issues. My problem with them is that they disgrace any alternative. They do not accept the possibility of a different way of worshiping Hashem. And this gaiva, this arrogance that says there is only one way, and I'm in charge on that way. And this way should be the nation's way, and I don't take any responsibility for implementing this way. This is something which is not acceptable.
Let me ask you on that, Rav Stav. Last week on the podcast, I had a Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, who argued that Elu va'elu divrei Elokim chayim, that both these and these can be the words of the living God. There are times when we don't want that to apply. And he used an example of that, Chareidi military service. He says, we can't say, I have my way, I believe my kids should go to the army, you have your way, you believe kids should not go to the army, and we're both okay. He says, there's a line past which we can't go, and we say that's not an acceptable Torah viewpoint. What do you say about that? What do you think in terms of their view when it comes to sending their kids to the army? Do you think that they can say what they want and that's okay?
No, first of all, they can say what they want. I mean, that's a part of human life, that people have the right to say whatever they want. And I don't want to live in a country where people will be restricted in their beliefs. But I think that you have to pay the price for your position. You cannot dare to ask the government to support your approach when you approach dangerous the entire country. If we don't have enough soldiers and my son-in-law has to do 200 days since October 7th, and my son has to do 250 days, and you will sit in yeshiva and you will get the same incentives of the government, that's unheard of. You are entitled to maintain, to stick to your position. But you should not expect that the government or the Knesset or the nation will support you as it supports those who take responsibility for this country. And I believe that a normal society would say, okay, I don't force you, but don't expect to get any incentives from our country if you are not ready to contribute anything to the country.
That makes sense. Rav Stav, do you believe that some people should receive exemptions from the army because they learn Torah? Or do you believe that, in theory, everyone should go to the army regardless of whether they're learning 3 Siddharim a day or regardless of whether they're an Eloi, a genius in Torah study?
The question is ideologically or practically. Ideologically, I believe that everybody should go to the army. I'm not saying the same amount of time, but everybody should. It's not that I believe. It's that what the Torah believes, that everybody should go to the war in Milchemet Mitzvah, and there is no exemption. On the other hand, I understand that there are societies that the values of Torah studies are, for whatever interpretation, are different. So I'm ready to accept that a certain amount of students will be released from that religious commitment. But to say that a whole group, a whole tribe is released from the army just because they wear a different kippah, just because they have a different lifestyle, that's something that is unheard of. By the way, I think it's against even the Chareidi original approach. Rav Shach and Chazon Ish and others said those who learn Torah will not go through the army. None of them is dare to dream that people, just because they are Charedim, because they are afraid they will be influenced by secular soldiers, that will be a reason or excuse not to go to the army. Unheard of.
You know, one of the biggest problems that I see in the Dati Leumi or modern Orthodox relationship with the Haredi world is an almost implicit assumption by many of us that they're the more authentic Jews. They're the one, when you say that, they say there's only one way of practicing Judaism. Many of them will say that. And maybe sometimes we actually buy into that because we say our way is okay and your way is okay. And they'll say only our way is okay. And that means that we feel sometimes intimidated. Sometimes we feel inferior. And I think this is a big problem, especially because we're not saying we're less than or more moderate because we don't care as much. We're saying this is the derech of Torah. This is the way it should be. What would you recommend that our leadership do in the Dati Leumi and modern and centrist Orthodox worlds in order to take away that feeling of inferiority and enable us to go forward proudly saying we are authentically representing what the Torah wants?
I think that we don't suffer anymore from this inferiority complex that we used to suffer in the past. I think we believe that we are not less than them. The opposite, we believe that the fact that they don't go to the army, they are sinning. That's a big sin because, as Moshe Rabbeinu points out, your brother would fight and you will remain here. I think that there is no inferiority complex today in the Israeli society. Having said that, I still think that not in the Dati Leumi society, but in the secular society, and especially in the traditional society among the Sephardim, what you described still exists, and therefore many of them do not want to come to a conflict with the Haredi society on this issue. I think that today there is no other option. I mean, today, if we will not solve this problem, I could easily see a situation where the woman will stop sending their kids, their husbands to the army. They will say, as long as the Haredim get these incentives and they do not go to the army, I don't see any reason why you should go to the army. So I think it almost becomes an existential threat on our society if we will not find a solution for one.
Rav Stav, in speaking about our own community, the Dati Leumi world, what are some of the biggest challenges that we have to face? We already talked about the problems we have with the Chareidi world, but internally, what are the biggest issues that are facing us today?
The modern Orthodox society or the Jewish society in general?
I'm speaking specifically about modern Orthodox or Dati Leumi.
Okay. So when we talk about modern Orthodox, I think that we have two major problems as a society. There is a big percentage of kids that go off the derech, and we need to deal with this. We cannot take it as something that is a decree from heaven, and to accept it. I think there is a lot to do in that area. That's one thing. And I think there is even a deeper need to deepen the ideas of modern Orthodoxy versus Chareidi world, conservative way on one side, and the very, very progressive liberal on the other side. And I think that the Dati Leumi youngsters are sometimes attracted by the very, very radical to the right, and sometimes they're attracted by the very, very radical of the left. As a society that is between these two worlds, because we are deeply involved in the army, in the universities, in other places, our kids are very much into it and are influenced by a lot of voices that do not fit to our original views as the Dati Leumi people, and I think there is a lot to do.
A lot of my listeners, in fact, most of them live in Chutz La'aretz. They live in the diaspora, and they may be saying right now, this is all very interesting, but why should I care? So Rav Stav, why should they care about what goes on here in Israel between the Dati Leumi community and the Chareidi community and internally inside the Dati Leumi world?
You know, it's a very important question. I want you to know that for your listeners in America, if the modern Orthodox in Israel will not be a strong movement, will not be a movement that will be a role model for how we can intertwine between words, that will show how we can combine between what we call in America Torah and Matter. But here in Israel, it's much broader. It's Torah and army, Torah and society, Torah and state. If we will not be able to show how these values could go together, it will make a huge bad impact on world Jewish society, because many Jews will say to themselves, well, there is no Judaism that could inspire me. And our mission is to carry the torch of Torah that believes in human values, that believes in the opportunity, in the option of combining between worlds. I think the mission that we have as a modern Orthodox in Israel will have a lot of impact in worldwide, and it's very important. I would give just a very simple example. Almost every modern Orthodox family sends its boy or daughter for a gap year in Israel. The question is, which Torah will they find in Israel? Will they find a Torah of tolerance, a Torah that encourages to combine between worlds, or will they come back to America with Torah that will shift them right away to the Chareidi world? That's one of the differences, but maybe that's one of the small differences.
Okay, Rav Stav, I know you have to go. One final question. I want to flip that question around. What should we expect from Jews in the diaspora? What should Israel be expecting them to be doing for us in the same way that we're demonstrating something for them?
I think that we need a lot. The assistance of American Jewry, world Jewry, but especially American Jewry. American rabbis and American immigrants, when they immigrated to Israel, they brought with them liberal values. They brought with them the ideas of being able to be a doctor and even being a Chareidi or being Dati doctor. The Americans could teach Israelis a lot about the way we deal with our conservative reform neighbors from the left and with the Charedim from the right, many issues that in Israel seem to be unsolvable, American model of life could show us that things could be handled differently. I think that's one of the issues.
Harav David Stav, I appreciate your time, and I thank you for joining me today on the podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.